Hi everyone, this is Trig Identities Day 1 video. So some vocabulary that you will hear is reciprocal. A reciprocal is a pair of numbers that when multiplied together they equal 1. This also works for variables and functions. So if we look at this first example, I have the fraction 3 over 4, 3/4, and it's reciprocal for thirds, meaning we just flip the fraction. When I multiply them together, I multiply the top together, 3 times 4, it gives me 12. Then I multiply the bottom together, 4 times 3, it gives me 12, and 12 over 12 gives me 1. Okay, if I look at the variables, I have x times 1 over x. As a reminder, x is technically x over 1. So if I flip it, I do get 1 over x. When I multiply them together, I would get x over x, which equals 1. Also, as a reminder, this right here, as we learned from properties of exponents, can be written as x to the negative first power. Remember, anytime we have a negative exponent, we can just move it to the denominator and it becomes a positive exponent. Our next vocab word would be quotient, a term found by dividing one expression by another. Okay, so an example of that would be tangent. We know tangent to be y over x or sine over cosine, so that's an example of a quotient. And then the last one is an identity. Two ways of writing the same value. So we know sine of theta to be equal to the opposite over the hypotenuse. We could say cosine theta is equal to adjacent over hypotenuse. Tangent is equal to opposite over adjacent. So those are things that we've learned. That is called an identity. So we have 6 reciprocal identities and 2 quotient identities. So these are ones that we do need to know. We need to have them memorized and we need to be able to recognize them when we see them. Okay, so sine is 1 over cosecant. That means cosecant is 1 over sine. If I multiply sine times cosecant, I should get 1. Cosine is 1 over secant, and secant is 1 over cosine. If I multiply those together, I will get 1. Tangent is 1 over cotangent. Cotangent is 1 over tangent. If I multiply those together, I get 1. Okay, the quotient identities break down tangent and cotangent into terms of sine and cosine. So tangent is sine over cosine, and cotangent is cosine over tangent, just showing you that they are reciprocals and they're just the flipped versions of each other. Okay, so what we want to do in our examples is to simplify the expressions into simplest form. Our first thing is to always write everything in terms of sine and cosine. Only sine and cosine, and then when we get to our final simplification, we can rewrite it as necessary. So I have sine x times cotangent x. Sine is already in terms of sine, so I'm just going to rewrite it down. But cotangent is not in terms of sine and cosine, so I am going to rewrite it as cosine over sine. So now I have everything written in terms of sine and cosine, so I can start my simplification process. Remember, sine x is technically sine over 1. So I'm going to cancel out anything that matches on top and on bottom. So on top, I have a sine x. On bottom, I have a sine x. They cancel each other out. It leaves me with cosine x over 1, which is just cosine x. And that would be the final answer. That is what it is, fully simplified. Moving on to example number 2, we have sine x times secant x times cotangent x. So again, we want everything in terms of sine and cosine only. So I have sine x gets to stay the same. Secant x gets to change into 1 over cosine. And then cotangent x, as we just talked about on the previous example, is cosine over sine. So I have cosine x over sine x. As a reminder, the first sine x is technically sine x over 1. So if I look at this, I have a sine on top, a sine on bottom. They cancel each other out. I have a cosine on top, a cosine on bottom. They cancel everything out. So that leaves me with 1 over 1, which is just 1. And that would be my answer. That's what that simplifies to. Looking at the next one, we have tangent x squared times secant x times cosine x. So before we start breaking this down, a couple of things I want to talk about. This right here can be rewritten as tangent x and then squared. Notice the parentheses. This is not the same as tangent x squared. Okay, those are two different things. And then another thing is that tangent x squared or tangent squared x can be rewritten as tangent x times tangent x. Okay, so the whole thing is being squared, not the variable. So in this case, it may be easiest if we rewrite this right here, this tan squared x, as two different tangents. I think that might be helpful. So we have tan x times tan x, and then I'm going to recopy down everything. So we have cosecant x times cosine x. Now I'm going to focus on rewriting everything in terms of sine and cosine. So tangent is sine x over cosine x. Tangent again, sine x over cosine x. Cosecant can be written as 1 over sine x. And then cosine is already in terms, but I'm going to go ahead and put it over 1. So we see what cancels out. I have a sine x on top, a sine x on bottom. I have a cosine x on top, a cosine x on bottom. That leaves me with just a sine over cosine. And we know sine over cosine is equal to tangent. So tangent would be my final answer. So anytime you get down to the last step, if you can rewrite it in one of the other forms, then that's the form we need to rewrite it in. Okay. Moving on to the last example, go ahead and add this to your notes. That way you have it. If you need to pause the video to write it down, pause the video. But we're going to simplify this. So again, we need to start by writing everything in terms of sine and cosine. So sine is already in terms. I'm going to go ahead and add a 1 underneath. Secant can be rewritten as 1 over cosine. So I have 1 over cosine x. And then tangent, again, is cosine over sine. Sine over cosine. So if we look here, there's nothing on top and bottom that cancels out. That happens sometimes. So how do we write our answer? Well, sine times sine, I just told you when we had tangent times tangent, it was tangent squared. So sine times sine is just sine squared x. And cosine times cosine is cosine squared x. Well, sine over cosine is equal to tangent squared x. So tangent squared x would be your final answer. So if you have any questions on this, please make sure you write it down and you ask your teacher the next time you see them in class.